Some newspaper articles from yesterday. The one on page A12 here is Novak accuses Plame source of distortion. Armitage minimizes role in leak. Columnist differs. This is yesterday off a column that was also in yesterday's paper. And right below it today, in today's New York Times by David Johnston, headline, Columnist contradicts leak source. First paragraph, Robert D. Novak, the columnist who first disclosed the identity of the intelligence officer in the CIA leak case, has disputed statements by his primary source, Richard L. Armitage, who said his mention of her identity was inadvertent. Good morning, Mr. Novak.
Good morning.
First, before I ask you about that, what are you doing in Urbana, Illinois?
It's home of the great University of Illinois. I'm an alumnus of the University of Illinois, class of '52, and this is the meeting of the annual meeting of the University of Illinois Foundation, of which I'm a member.
You've made news here in this town for the last 2 days. What's your take on just how people have been writing up your column?
Well, I think people found it of some interest that I disputed Mr. Armitage's account, and it's the first time I'd ever described publicly what he had said to me. People who don't, I thought people took it with some, with some interest. Those people who didn't have an axe to grind and didn't feel that somehow or another my account was undermining their preconceived notions of the case. And there are many people, of course, who did have preconceived notions of this much exaggerated case.
How much more is there to come out on this story?
I think, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing more to come out. I think everything has been said. I don't think there's any secrets, any smoking guns. There was a indictment in criminal prosecution of Louis Libby, Vice President Cheney's former chief of staff, which has an entirely different course in mind, and I have not really made myself well acquainted with that case. I know nothing about it, and there may be some more material come out of it, and may not. But the main story of how Valerie Plame Wilson's name appeared in my column, I think everybody who reads newspapers knows everything there is to know.
When this whole story first came out, how long after it came out, your column, and then when the prosecution started, did you know that Richard Armitage had told the prosecutor that he was the leak?
I didn't know until quite recently that he had told the prosecutor. I knew the prosecutor, Patrick Fitzgerald, knew that Armitage was the leak because in the first secret interrogation of me in my lawyer's office early in 2004, the special prosecutor, Mr. Fitzgerald, indicated he knew the identity of not only my primary source, but my secondary source and my tertiary source. He knew their names. So how he got the names, I didn't know. And I didn't know that Mr. Armitage had volunteered his name until, I guess, the week before last.
At that time when you were asked, did you confirm it?
Yes, I did, because he had the information. He knew it. There was no point in me playing games with the special prosecutor, particularly since my lawyers had informed me there was very little chance that if I had remained mute, since he had the information anyway, there was very little chance I would have prevailed in the Supreme Court at great expense to myself. The journalist who did go all the way to the Supreme Court lost the case. There is no shield. There is no privilege for withholding that kind of information for journalists. Whether they should be or not is a subject for another program, I would imagine.
Should Judy Miller have gone to jail?
I would hope she shouldn't have. I think to go to jail for not talking about a story she didn't write offends me. I blame her lawyers, however, for taking her down that route. First Amendment lawyers for the New York Times with very deep pockets, and was no pain for them, no pain for the New York Times. Great deal of pain for Judy Miller and her career.
Richard Armitage was your first source. Who was your second, and who was your third?
Well, that's been identified a long time ago, as you know. Because they identified themselves. I identified none of these sources publicly. Identified none of them to the authorities. They all the authorities found out about them in various ways, and they identified themselves. The second source, which was just a very quick confirmation, was Karl Rove, and the third source was just a routine question to the public information officer of the CIA, a man named Bill Harlow.
Have you seen Victoria Tunzing's op-ed piece in this morning's Wall Street Journal yet?
No, it's early out. It's early out here, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Let me just read the first two paragraphs and get your reaction. Richard Armitage has finally emerged from the cover my backside closet, apologizing on CBS for keeping quiet for almost 3 years about being the original source for Robert Novak's July 14, 2003 column stating that Joe Wilson's wife, Valerie Plame, worked for the CIA and suggested him for the mission to Niger. He disingenuously blames his silence on Special Counsel Patrick Fitzgerald's non-legally based request. Any witness is free to talk about his or her testimony, not to discuss the matter. Put aside hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayer funds squandered on the investigation, New York Times reporter Judith Miller's 85 days in jail, the angst and legal fees of scores of witnesses, the White House held siege to a criminal investigation while fighting the war on terror, Karl Rove's reputation maligned, and Scooter Libby's resignation and indictment. By his silence, Mr. Armitage is responsible for one of the most factually distorted investigations in history. Do you agree?
Well, I don't know if I agree with every word. I don't disagree with any of it. Let's just say it's not my style, not the kind of thing I would write, but I have a great deal of respect for Ms. Tenzing, and I can't disagree with any of the points she makes. How's that for a politician's answer?
What's the fallout from all this? What things in the future will have changed because of all this investigation?
Well, that's based on the theory that Washington learns from mistakes, and you go a different route. And I will have been in Washington 50 years in May, and they don't learn from mistakes. I would think that the government, that President Bush and the former Attorney General Ashcroft should know that special prosecutors, even when they are employees of the Justice Department, as Patrick Fitzgerald indicated, is not a good idea. They don't have accountability. They don't have responsibility to higher authority. They always drag on, not always, but most of the time drag on down side alleys. So I would say that if Washington learned from his mistakes, they would have said no more special prosecutors. But I would say that they should have learned that lesson long ago.
So you go back to the beginning of all this. Who was responsible for forcing the use of a special prosecutor in the first place? The Democrats, the Republicans, the White House? Who made this happen?
Well, there was an enormous hue and cry that was ginned up by left-wing journalists such as David Corn of the Nation, and by a left-wing investigative team for Newsday newspapers, and the Senator Chuck Schumer leading the way. Some very, very partisan Democrats hyped up the case weeks after my column blew this whole case out of proportion, as if a great national secret had been divulged and a great intelligence failure had been perpetrated. And I thought that the administration and the president, of course, they have a lot of other things on their mind, cracked. They couldn't take the pressure. Attorney General Ashcroft recused himself. I don't think that was necessary at all. And then his deputy decided to name a special prosecutor. It was then taken out of the hands of the White House, and we were off to the races with a multi-million-dollar investigation of a case where I think Ms. Tenzing is quite correct that there was no crime committed. They knew very early there was no crime committed by my writing the Mrs. Wilson's name in the column, and that they knew the identity of the leakers. So it was a very unnecessary investigation causing a lot of pain. I think there should be some great embarrassment by Senator Schumer and these people who were calling this one of the crimes of the century, and giving speeches on the Senate floor and having ad hoc hearings, which were, I believe, carried on C-SPAN, when it was all much to do about nothing, in my opinion.
Robert Novak's our guest. He's based out there at the University of Illinois this morning. We got some calls from Clinton, Connecticut. First one up. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. It's been said that Armitage was part of the Powell's clique, and he was not involved with the pro-war people from Clinton's administration. But he was one of the signatories to the Project for the New American Century, urging Clinton to go to war. How does that square?
Well, you were right the first time. He was very close he and Colin Powell, I've written in columns, were joined at the hip. They were skeptics on going to war in Iraq, very cautious. As a matter of fact, I was against going to war in Iraq, both in my television appearances and in my column. I said there were no, I was one of the few journalists who said there was no weapons of mass destruction. I said it was not in our national interest to intervene there, and so it's really ridiculous to say that this was some kind of attempt to attack Joe Wilson because he was anti-war by one of the few officials in the administration who was anti-war and by one of the few conservative journalists who was anti-war.
Let's go next to Nashville, Tennessee. Good morning. You're on with Bob Novak.
Good morning. I got a couple of questions. The first one would be a yes and no, and then I have a follow-up. Did he see the CBS interview with David Martin and Armitage?
Yes.
You did. So in that interview, Armitage said that he told Colin Powell, and Colin Powell got with the Justice Department. This all happened before the special prosecutor ever come into play. What do you say about that?
Well, I wish you'd read my column, because that's what my column was all about. I thought that Mr. Armitage was very disingenuous in his interview with Mr. Martin, because he indicated that, in the first place, he indicated that he had said he thought that Mrs. Wilson worked at the CIA, and he just kind of suggested he had heard that, when in fact he told me very flatly she worked there, and that she told me what division she worked in, the Counter-Proliferation Division. He also indicated that this was just chit-chat, implying that he never thought it would appear in print, when in fact he told me that he thought this was the kind of column that my late partner Roland Evans and I specialized in, inside Washington dope. I also say in the column that it's disingenuous for Mr. Armitage to say that he could not reveal publicly that he was the source, or reveal to anybody that he was the source of my column, because he had been asked to by the special prosecutor, when in fact the special prosecutor was not named until December 30th, 2003. He should have known he was the source when the column appeared on July 14th, 2003. He says he didn't realize it till October 1st, but that still gave him 3 months before the special prosecutor was named, in which he was totally free to reveal his name.
Do you have any
himself as a source?
Do you have any knowledge as to when the president and Karl Rove and the people around the vice president would have known that he was a source?
I don't really know that information. That's very closely held. I have not been able to find out. President still says he can't talk about it because of the case by the investigation by the special prosecutor, which seems to have totally run its course. But there is a criminal prosecution that keeps it lingering against Scooter Libby. Did the president know until 2 weeks ago that Armitage was my source? I happen to know for a fact that he did. Exactly when, I don't know, but I have a very good source that informs me that he did know. Well,
what the thing is hard for people to understand is at that point, and this was such the press was spending so much time on it, why wouldn't the president just have picked up the phone and called Colin Powell and said, talk to Dick Armitage and get him to announce this thing, let's get this over with?
Well, I have thought about that many times, and I also said in the column, I'm free in that column to say a lot of things I was under wraps about, because a lot of it came out in the book by Michael Isikoff and David Korn. But I said that on October 1st, the day the second column ran, and after it was clear that the Justice Department was investigating, that Ken Duberstein, the former White House Chief of Staff and lobbyist, telephoned me and said that Armitage was afraid that he might have inadvertently been my source, and he was checking with me to find out if he was my source. I thought that was just absolute blather, so I gave an evasive answer. I didn't answer the question. Of course he knew he was my source. And he also said that he thought that Mr. Armitage was considering turning himself in and resigning as Deputy Secretary of State. I said that would be unfortunate, meaning I thought he was a valuable public servant, but it was his choice. And so he very well could have gone public at that time. Perhaps he would have cost him his job, but perhaps that was the proper thing to do. I'm not making that judgment.
Richmond, Virginia, for Bob Novak.
Yes, sir. Okay, I'm a Nixon Republican, and I just can't figure it out. How is Bush able to, all these forces that were so hostile to Nixon, he's able to use them to his favor? I mean, I guess you'd have to say Nixon's hostility to the rich is evidently what did him in. But especially like this Bob Woodward and especially the Washington Post. Could you comment on that? Thank you.
And by the way, Bob Novak, did Bob Woodward know about this story before or after you?
According to his own indications, he knew about it before me, but he didn't write anything. See, there's a lot of things people know that they don't write. I wrote this, and that's why it became a controversy. I don't really have any theory on why Nixon didn't survive and George W. Bush survives.
Springfield, Virginia, good morning.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I'm a Republican that's kind of barely hanging on to being a Republican in the current current climate here with this administration, and I think one of the things that continues to get blurred in this, and I think Mr. Novak plays a large role in this, is that this is, regardless of whether there was a crime of revealing Valerie Plame's name, it's clear that the administration was politicizing this and was using it to attack Joe Wilson, and so much distortions have been made against Joe Wilson and his wife on this. And
like what, caller?
Excuse me?
Like what?
Well, like people going around saying that Joe Wilson was actually the person who revealed his wife's name. That revealed that she was a CIA operative and that she really wasn't covert and all these sort of things. And there's plenty of indications out here that I would think that Mr. Novak is now talking in great deal about this, because he himself was one of the subjects of this investigation by Mr. Fitzgerald, not for a crime of revealing this, but for being disingenuous or flat out lying in the grand jury. The same thing that Mr. Libby.
Are you suggesting that Mr. Novak lied to the grand jury?
I'm suggesting that right now he's trying to keep himself out of legal problems, and by putting the issue onto Mr. Armitage. I'm certainly not the only one saying. I've been reading about that already. That a lot of people are talking about this. That Mr. Novak's current public relations act on this is all about that.
Thanks.
I'm always amused, Brian, about the Republicans. People call in and say they're Republicans. Now, you have no control over that. You can have a communist call in and say he's a Republican. This guy's about as much a Republican as my foot is. He's got the whole Joe Wilson line down pat. Joe Wilson was the first person who knew that his wife was a covert employee, not a covert employee, who identified her as such. The point of the matter is, but about myself, I was never this. I mean, I just despise these people, these bloggers, and people getting on C-SPAN on calls and saying things they know nothing about, not the slightest thing, with no responsibility. I was never a target of this investigation. I was a cooperative witness because my lawyer advised me to be. My lawyers had told me always tell the truth and never make anything up. If you don't remember something, say you don't remember it. I was totally cooperative and received the thanks from my cooperation from Mr. Fitzgerald. I was never a target of anything. I testified under oath to him, to the FBI, and finally to the grand jury. They asked me not to reveal it, and at their request, I didn't reveal it. I am talking now not in a public relations attempt. I don't have a public relations man. I'm not a politician. I'm a journalist. But because under a journalist rule, I could not give the final thing that I had kept secret, who my primary source was, until he identified himself. Not when Bob Woodward identified him, which he didn't, of course, or not when Ben Bradley suspected that it was Mr. Armitage. Not when I couldn't reveal him when it came out in the Issacoff Corn book. Not until Armitage went on CBS with David Martin and said, "Yes, I am the source." Then I was free to reveal it. It's not a public relations device, and I guarantee you I am in no danger of being prosecuted because I've told the truth at all times.
What do you say to the speculation that Joe Wilson was the source for the Korn-Issacoff book?
Hey, he was a big source for it with Korn. Korn that's a very odd couple, Issacoff and Korn. Issacoff says he is non-ideological and nonpartisan. I think he is. I think he's a great investigative reporter, but that's a very odd couple because Korn is a left-wing ideologue from The Nation magazine. In Mr. Wilson's memoir, he has Korn advising him, telling him that a law was broken, egging him on. So he was a part of the whole build-up of this story, and it's deeply ironic that his book is the book that is being used to indicate that there was no conspiracy, that you can't, in your wildest imagination, imagine Armitage as part of a plot to undermine the Wilsons. And so, of course, Korn is frantic. He's writing blogs and writing in The Nation, saying there was another track, which is a great conspiracy theory. There's always another track. So I think that there's no doubt that there was a close relationship with Korn and Wilson.
We're talking to Bob Novak. He's in Urbana, Illinois this morning at his old alma mater, University of Illinois. Swannanoa, North Carolina, you're next. George Bush supporter.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to say thank you for C-SPAN. And Mr. Novak, I'd like to strongly disagree with that last caller. I don't believe that you're on any kind of public relations mission or anything. If anybody is, it would be Mr. Wilson. And but my comment would be about it seems like the facts of this case are very distorted, and that before any information was really known, the media, in particular Chris Matthews and Hardball, he talked about this issue almost every day. There was a segment of his program that was devoted to this issue, and just about every day you tune in, you wouldn't learn anything new, but you would get a lot of what I would call conjecture, a lot of, well, if this is true, if our government's doing this, then what else is it doing? And, you've got literally, if you were to go through the archives, you've got literally dozens and dozens, perhaps even hundreds of hours of broadcasting on just conjecture of what else is our government doing if it's dropping names of CIA operatives for political use. And my question would be, how much do you think Chris Matthews is going to talk about this story now that all of his conjecture is kind of proven to be much ado about nothing?
Well, thank you. My problem here, sir, is that I never watch Chris Matthews' program because I don't feel that I could possibly learn anything from all that shouting and blather and interrupting people. So I haven't watched his program in years. I don't know what he said much about this, and I don't care. I can imagine that Mr. Matthews believes that being mistaken in journalism is never having to say you're sorry. So I don't think he'll say much of anything. I would say that the most of the press really ignored this story. I think they intuitively felt that there was a built-up phony story. At the beginning, there was a lot of attention paid to it. There was a lot of bad journalism on this story. You could write a book on the bad journalism involved of exaggerating it. But journalists don't say they're sorry. In fact, they never even say they're wrong. It's part of. I think we accept that as our First Amendment right to be wrong.
By the way, wouldn't the administration have the right, if they thought that Joe Wilson's report was inaccurate, to do what they do all the time, is raise the idea that he was wrong? I mean, what would have been wrong with that?
They should have. In the column that the column that caused all the trouble, my column of July 14th of 2003, in which I identified Joe Wilson's wife as a CIA employee. That was just a very small part of the column. There was a great deal about his mission, and I suggested at the end of the column that the quoted a very senior administration official. I won't say who it was, a White House official it was, who said that he thought it would be a good idea to declassify this report and release it. And I said it would be a good idea too. I think they should have. It was one thing that it's never shown is that it was a sloppy job, and it was an oral report. It was never a written report, and I can't believe that it couldn't have been declassified and released. But this administration has not been known for transparency and has gotten itself in a lot of trouble in being overly secretive.
For Bob Novak, we go to San Diego. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. Mr. Novak, I was wondering if you could remind me and perhaps elaborate on Mr. Libby's role in all of this, and if I'm not mistaken, he's accused of perjuring himself. But the leak of this information seems to have come out of the State Department. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that for me. Thank you very much.
Well, it's not that it seems to have come out of the State Department. It did come out of the State Department. That was the leak. We know that now. We don't have to pussyfoot around. That was the leak to me, and that's what appeared in print. I don't know much about Mr. Libby's. I feel sorry for him. I thought he was a valuable public servant, even though I disagreed with him on intervening in Iraq. But I was very fond of the vice president, and I thought I admired Mr. Libby. I don't know. I didn't have any contact with him on this. I'm not a part of that case. There was no crime committed prior to the investigation. The investigation produced the alleged crime of obstruction of justice and perjury by Mr. Libby. And I don't know the facts of it. I don't know the details of it. A trial, it's cost him millions of dollars. It's destroyed his public career. But all this happened after my column ran. And the trial is scheduled to take place in January.
I know it's none of our business, but I'll ask you anyway. How much money did you have to spend on legal fees?
Well, it isn't any of your business, and I spent too much, but it was nothing like what Mr. Libby went, because I was not a target. But I did like to get legal advice. I didn't want to make any mistakes, and my home paper, the Chicago Sun-Times, was helpful in meeting those expenses.
Well, it might be interesting to know what everybody has been spending on legal fees if you totaled it all up for all the people that have been in front of the grand jury and everything. You think it's...
Oh, it'd be millions, because there was one gentleman, a private citizen who I talked to frequently, and they found him sending an email to Karl Rove in which he talked about it, and he had to spend as much on legal fees as I did. He was called before the grand jury twice because he had sent this email to Karl Rove. So that is the whole problem with these special prosecutor, with many federal investigations, but particularly special prosecutor investigations. The lawyer's mind is you sweep out, you look at every possibility. Much of it amounts to nothing, absolutely nothing, but it does cause a great deal of expense, as you say, Brian.
Westfield, Massachusetts, George Bush supporter.
Good morning. Mr. Novak, I've been a fan of yours since I was in high school in the 1960s. It's good to speak to you. I have a couple of questions. Wilson refers to a friend of his who ran into you on the street, and you cast aspersions on Wilson. Number two, could you elaborate on the role of this Mark Grossman from the State Department, who was the college roommate of Wilson? And three, do you have any idea of why the 16 words were taken out? I mean, who in the CIA brought that to the White House attention, that they reneged on that? And four, why isn't Wilson and Plame indicted for conspiracy?
Oh, that's a lot of stuff. First question was, as a matter of fact, I was returning to my office, walking to my office, and now I can say it, from my interview with Mr. Armitage, when somebody got me on the street and started harassing me about what a great hero Joe Wilson was, and I blurted out my opinion of him, which I shouldn't do. I shouldn't talk to total strangers on the street. And I try not to anymore. They often approach me, but I try to show more sense. That was not a sensible thing on my part to do, but in the great scheme of things, not very important. What was your second one?
I don't remember. Let me move on.
That's trouble with multiple. That's trouble with multiple. I tell you what, the answer to the I have no answer to all the others anyway, so we can dispose of them.
I have an email here from A.F. Nerriman of Williamsville, New York. I would request that you ask your guest, Robert Novak, whom did Armitage cite as his sources? Rove, Libby. What was his stated purpose in telling you Valerie Plame's name? Was it an inadvertent slip or something more?
Well, give me a break. if you're a journalist and you sit down with somebody and a deputy secretary, a sub-cabinet member, tells you that piece of information, you say, "What's your source on that?" Well, I didn't ask him his source. I checked it out, but I was sure that Mr. Armitage was not making it up. He would, make up things like that. His source happened to be a State Department memo. And one of the reasons he says now, and I agree with him on this, that he used Mrs. Wilson's name, was he couldn't believe that in a State Department memo the name of a covert agent would be included. She was not a covert agent. That's the one part of this case that's going to be debated, I suppose, into the future. She was not a covert agent. She was covered. She was not. But everybody in town, not everybody in town, but a great number of people in town knew that she was working for the C.I.A. Now, what was his motive? I don't know what his motive was. He had a reputation as liking to pass gossip, I spent a lot of in my 50 years, almost 50 years in Washington, I spent a lot of time having people give me information, and I don't really know why they do. I hope I inject a kind of truth serum on people, that they tell me things that they shouldn't. Maybe he was trying to get the State Department off the hook on the Wilson mission, that they were not responsible for sending him. Was there any other question involved in that?
Yeah, there's a second one. What did you mean when you stated at a conservative function in December of 2005, quote, "Why are you asking me? Ask President Bush. He knows who the leaker is."
Yeah, I thought there was no reporters present there, so but I thought that the president knew in December 2005, and there's some. I don't know exactly when he found out, but I have found from a very good source that he did know. He didn't find out about it from the rest of the world by reading the Issakoff Korn book or by hearing Armitage on CBS. Exactly when he knew it, I don't know, but I found it hard to believe in 2005 that he didn't know it by then.
Franklin, Tennessee, for Bob Novak. Good morning.
Yes, thanks for taking my call. I was just curious. I didn't read your original article, but why was it important to include Valerie Plame's name in your article? What was the significance of disclosing her identity as a CIA operative or whatever she was?
The question I asked Mr. Armitage was why we had been discussing the Wilson mission to Niger in some detail. I still consider myself bound by the journalistic rules of confidence to say exactly what he was saying about that mission. Whether it was good or bad, because that was not for publication. He hasn't revealed it, and so I'm not going to reveal it. But at one point, it wasn't at the very end of the interview, as he indicates, but near the end, and I said, why was it that Joe Wilson, not an expert in intelligence, not an expert in nuclear policy, no experience for some time in Africa, was sent on this delicate mission? And he said, well, his wife. I thought that was a good question. A lot of people were asking that question who were not particularly hostile to Joe Wilson. I was not hostile to him at that time. And he said that, his wife requested it. She suggested it, I should say. She suggested the mission, and she works for the Counter-Proliferation Division at the CIA. I thought that was news, and so I put it in. I write a lot of news that makes people uncomfortable, and I thought that it added to the story. I thought it was so important, I put it in the 8th paragraph of a 13th paragraph column. That's roughly where it was, right about in the middle, so it wasn't an earth-shaking development, but I thought it was important enough to be printed.
McPherson, Kansas, you're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Novak. First of all, I'd like to commend you in an age where the media seems to be doing more and more bomb throwing for being a speaker of the truth. I feel that had this story stuck to the way the liberals wanted it to, you probably would be up for a Nobel Peace Prize. But my question to you is, what do you think is going to happen with this lawsuit, and how far do you think it will go?
Okay, I know there was one question from from one of those people I didn't answer, and that was, should Joe and Valerie Wilson be indicted? And I am certainly I know of no laws that they have broken. The lawsuit, I am not a lawyer, but most of the lawyers I have consulted think that the lawsuit is going nowhere, that it has to prove that there was an animus and a desire to destroy Joe Wilson, which, particularly in the case of Richard Armitage, would be impossible to decide. So I would guess it goes nowhere. But we're a very litigious country. We're a country of lawyers. We've got, if I could make an editorial judgment, we've got too damn many lawyers, in my opinion. And I think that anything can happen in the courts in this country, no matter, I believe, a final judgment by the Wilsons is probably not possible. They want to keep this story alive. It's very difficult to keep it alive now. Mrs. Wilson had a very fat book contract, which for one reason or another was canceled, and he said they got another one just as good. I haven't heard what the name of that book house was, or if there is another one, but they'd like to keep the story going.
Are you going to write a book about this?
Not about this. Oh no, I have a memoir which I have finished, and I hope to be on C-SPAN someday talking about it. It'll be published. Won't be published till next year. In its present form, it's about twice the length of War and Peace. So we have to cut it back. But it's about my career, and particularly my 50 years. Be 50 years in May in Washington.
Denham Springs, Louisiana.
Yes, thanks, Brian, for C-SPAN letting me get on. I'd like to ask Mr. Novak. He stated that Armitage was his primary contact, but he also stated somewhere along there that he had secondary. Who else called him and tipped him off the Valerie Plame being the
I really hate these distortions. You know, you make things up that you don't know anything about. Nobody called me. I didn't say that Mr. Armitage called me. I was in an interview with him, and I raised a question, and he answered it. As for the secondary and tertiary sources, I revealed them in a column some time ago because they had revealed themselves through one through his attorney and one by himself as my sources. So there was no secret there. The secondary source was Karl Rove. I called him up and told him, "Did you know this?" And I told him this story, and he said, he says, "You know that too." I took that as a confirmation. That's all he said about it. He didn't call me. And the third source was the Public Information Director at C.I.A., Bill Harlow, who asked me not to write the story, said he couldn't say that she was an undercover person, did not say she was in danger, but obviously confirmed that Mrs. Wilson was employed by the CIA.
David Korn will be on this network on Monday at 7:45, and he writes in his blog here, writes about your column yesterday. He says, Novak, as he acknowledges, did not take notes of this hour-long conversation with Richard Armitage, which might strike some reporters as odd, given that he had been endeavoring for years to snag an interview with Armitage. So outsiders are left with the he said, she said tussle. But Novak's latest account does seem to contradict an earlier version.
Well, Mr. Korn is a nasty piece of work, let me tell you that. And he was the one who really built this story up. He is in what I think is a deliciously ironic situation, because he was one of the people, much more, I believe, than Chris Matthews, for building the story up at the outset. He was, as I said, he was advising Joe Wilson, which he never puts in his column. And he is in the position where I think mostly through investigative work done by his partner, Mr. Isikoff, he is really a party to breaking down the story and making it appear there was no conspiracy at all, which must actually destroy him. Now, he is so outraged at me on this that he is taking seems to be taking Armitage's side in a dispute over what was said. He doesn't know what was said there because there's only two people there. I said in my column, which of course he didn't quote, that I had reconstructed my conversation shortly after I saw Mr. Armitage, because I had to write a column. Well, I think Mr. Armitage maybe reconstructed his for prosecutors months later, and I think my account is not close to the truth. It is completely truthful because I've sworn to it under oath. And I remember exactly what I said. I find it resentful that a left-wing ideologue should dispute my repertorial techniques for 50 years. I have been sitting down with high government officials for interviews for since the column started 44 years ago, and even before that when I worked for the Wall Street Journal, and very much to try to get these people into a conversational tone of view where you get information from them. And I got a lot of information from Mr. Armitage that I still won't attribute to him, but later appeared in later columns. And it is off-putting to have a pencil and pen taking down what he said. You can say, no, I'm not going to quote you on that, but they're very nervous about it. It's a technique I have used for many years, and I think I have been extremely accurate on it. And I think he is just desperately trying to find some way to keep this story alive for his friend Joe Wilson.
How often do you not take notes?
Almost always. An interview with a cabinet member, somebody like Colin Powell, some Secretary of the Treasury, I almost never take notes. I think it turns it into a much more sterile thing. If it is on background and I'm trying to get information, that's a technique I think a lot of reporters use. I don't think Mr. Korn is really a reporter as much as he is a editorialist, and so I don't think he's really interested in getting facts. He's interested in putting out a line.
Bella Vista, Arkansas, for Bob Novak. You're on the air.
Mr. Novak, hi. I love your columns, and I just want to know if you think that President Bush should pardon Mr. Libby.
Well, I would hope he would pardon him. The president is the leader of the Republican Party. Obviously, he's not going to pardon him before this election. The question: will he pardon him before the trial? A lot of people are advising him not to. I feel great sympathy for Mr. Libby. I would hope that he would, but that's obviously a presidential decision.
Dayton, Ohio.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for C-SPAN. Mr. Novak, earlier you commented on, I think it was Chris Matthews and Hardball, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that you never get any information from such shows. It's nothing but yelling and partisan bickering. But I find it ironic that it's kind of a mimic of Crossfire. It's just people in boxes instead of on the stage with you. And that, it kind of mimicked that show being the kind of prototypical partisan bickering show, the Crossfire. And my question is, after Jon Stewart came on and pointed this out for the American people and finally did justice on the Crossfire, I just wondered, was it him that caused Crossfire to be canceled, or is there some other reason?
Well, the new management that came in didn't like it, didn't like the show. I thought the Crossfire, I was on the Crossfire off and on for a quarter of a century, and I thought particularly, for most of its life, I thought Crossfire was not like the Chris Matthews show, although I shouldn't be too critical of Chris Matthews because I haven't seen it in years. But it was terrible when I did see it. But I don't believe that it was anything like that. In writing my memoirs, I got some old tapes and transcripts, and it was surprisingly civil for most of its career. It was intense. The interviews were intense, but people didn't shout, didn't interrupt each other. I think it's a reformation with a live audience and with my friends James Carville and Paul Begala on the left. It became much more discordant in its final years.
You always talk about having a new nugget of information in every column you write. Are you doing the same thing in your memoir? Will there be new information that we've never heard before?
Yes, there will be. There'll be a lot of information, and I'm revealing some sources. I don't reveal all my sources, but I reveal some on a kind of an eclectic basis. I'm going to make a lot of people mad, Mr. Rash, but they're going to make a lot of people mad, but Mr. Lamb, but most of them are dead, so they can't protest.
You've been around this earth since February of 1931, making you about 75 years old. How much longer are you going to do this?
Well, I thought I would have stopped long ago, but I have no retirement plans. I don't have any hobbies except going to sports events, and you can't do that full time. So I don't think I'll ever stop. I think I thought my memoirs I would tell everything and make everybody mad, and Mr. Lamb, and go into the grave that way. But I'm going to keep going, and as long as people will listen to me, and I'm now with a contributor to the Fox Network, and they've been very nice to me, and I'm still keeping my column and my newsletter going, so I'm not quite as busy as I used to be, but pretty busy.
Lexington, Kentucky. Good morning for Bob Novak.
Good morning. Mr. Novak, I forget where I read it, wasn't it true that Joe Wilson actually outed his wife in his bio and Who's Who?
Well, let me tell you the full story on that. When I talked to Mr. Armitage and got the fact that his wife was worked for the CIA and had suggested the mission, and then I got a confirmation, a one-sentence confirmation from Rove, and then I talked about him from Mr. Harlow at the CIA, who said she didn't suggest the mission, but confirmed she was with the CIA. I never got her name. Nobody told me her name. So I, as a intrepid reporter, I looked. I got a copy of Who's Who, and there was her name, Valerie Plame. So I put it in.
Charlestown, Rhode Island. You're on with Bob Novak.
Yes, I'm just calling to say how much I've really enjoyed Mr. Novak and his being on Crossfire and Capital Gang, and I was born in 1932, so we're about the same generation and went through, and this business about Valerie Plame, it seems so dry to me compared to Wayne Hayes and Annabella Battistella, when I thought that was a riot. And then another thing I wanted...
It was more fun, wasn't it?
And then another thing I wanted to mention was your comments about Janet Reno going to get Alien Gonzalez. I just thought that to have that picture going around the world for our country was just terrible. I mean, where is the rule of law? That's what I thought. Well, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with you.
Mr. Novak, after, there have been some deep feelings on all this subject in the last couple of years. Are there people that you no longer talk to you about all this? I mean, you had the difficulty with CNN, you left there. I mean, are you angry about much of this stuff?
No, I'm not angry. I'm not angry at all. I've had a blessed, charmed life, and I think I've been vindicated on this story. Just to correct you slightly, on CNN, my contract expired on January 1st, 2006. After 25 years, it had been renewed repeatedly over those years, and I wanted to leave CNN. I thought the time had come to go, and they wanted me to leave. So it was a mutual, harmonious parting. They didn't say I had to go. There's in the Issakoff Korn book. There's implications. Or I'm sorry, I've got the wrong screed wrong. There's another book I won't publicize that indicated I was kicked out, but it was a mutual feeling. I would say that there are people who I was very disappointed in, who attacked me on this on this story. I'm not going to go into detail on this program this morning. I will say too that because of this story, my contacts with the administration were reduced by the choice of the White House and by the choice of the administration. Not entirely by any means. I have very good contacts there, but there were some contacts that were completely severed. I thought that was a mistake on their part, but that's their choice. I've lived through a lot of administrations, Brian, and had very slender contact with a lot of them, but you can always find some ways to get the news. I still have better. I think probably the low point of my contacts was toward the end of the Carter administration when nobody was talking to me, and I still got a lot of news out of it, news they didn't want told. So I'm not the kind of reporter that needs high-level access. I can prosper with low-level access, and so I'm not bitter and unhappy. The only thing I regret is having to pay the legal fees, but luckily I was able to absorb that.
Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, for Bob Novak.
Good morning. My question, Mr. Novak, is if Mr. Fitzgerald knew right from the beginning who the leaker was, why go through this whole exercise?
Well, I imagine he would tell you that he was trying to find whether there was a conspiracy going, that there was some kind of a plot that involved the vice president's office and Karl Rove and goodness knows all things all working together in some sinister plot. That's the way lawyers are, and particularly independent consuls, special consuls, because they don't have anybody reviewing their judgments. They are a law unto themselves, and perhaps Mr. Fitzgerald did the right thing. I don't know. It caused a lot of people pain, but I say that would be the rationale for his continuing the investigation to find if there was a conspiracy at work and it wasn't just poor old Armitage giving me this information.
Kathleen of Athens, Ohio, writes this morning, how can Armitage be the first leaker when Scooter Libby leaked information about Valerie Wilson Plame to Judith Miller of the New York Times weeks before Novak entered the office of Armitage, and Libby also confirmed Rove's leak to Cooper? Quote, when a firing squad is assembled to execute someone, does anyone care whose bullet hits first, unquote?
Well, this is a part of the desperate attempt to try to engage us as a White House plot. The only person, the first revelation of this story was by me, and I can't deal with stories that didn't get written. So this was my first source. It was the first source that appeared in print, and it was the source that created the appointment by the Justice Department of a special prosecutor. That's what they appointed it for, to look into the leak that appeared in my column.
Would Mr. Fitzgerald had continued the investigation because he found that Bob Woodruff had been given this information before you had gotten it, and that in the White House they had been spreading this word before you had been told it? Would that possibly be the reason why he would have continued?
Well, he didn't know about Woodward for some time to come after he had gone on far afield on this investigation. I'd rather, I think Mr. Fitzgerald is a man of integrity. I don't think he's a political person at all. I regret that he carried it as far, but I don't question his integrity, or I don't question his desire to do the right thing. But I certainly can't interpret why he would have done under hypothetical circumstances.
Houston, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Hello, my name is Brendan Ryan from Houston, Texas, and I watched a lot of Crossfire when I was a kid. I'm only 24 years old, but I had watched Cross for about as long as I can remember. And I don't think that Chris Matthews does any justice to the American people as far as informative information on politics and what's going on in Washington. I think Crossfire was a much different show. It offered much better depth into politics in Washington, and that I would just say that there needs to be another show like Crossfire.
Thanks. Mr. Novak.
Well, thank you very much.
On the Chris Matthews thing, it brings up the question is, how much television do you watch? What other shows do you watch, and do you spend much time in front of that too?
Well, I do spend a lot of time. I'm able to what's the fancy term now, multitask. I'm able to write and talk on the telephone and watch television at the same time, which is pretty good for an old man, isn't it, Brian? I have a television set right next to my terminal at work, and I have one next to my terminal at home. And I do a lot of C-SPAN watching. I really enjoy. I watch the Senate, House, particularly the Senate. I get a lot of story ideas from that. I watch a lot of C-SPAN, and I watch the cable networks considerably. But I don't watch. I have a lot of problems with Chris Matthews, which I won't go into. This is not the hit Chris Matthews show, but I just don't watch that program. And I certainly, somebody mentioned the Jon Stewart program. I've never seen that in my life, and I will go to my grave never having seen it.
Why?
I don't see any reason for it. It's a comedian, a self-righteous comedian taking on airs of grandeur, and I don't really need that. I think the politicians are funny enough without needing a professional comic.
Lake City, Tennessee, good morning. No, we don't have Lake City. We have Gaston, Alabama. You're on the air.
Is this me?
That's you. Go ahead, sir.
Well, Mr. Novak said he left CNN, and he's kind of glad of it. I suppose he's proud to be with Fox. He ought to be right at home with that network. He didn't like Chris Matthews, but I bet he likes old Sean Hannity, the way he interviews his guests and says, you say what I want you to say, or either shut up and blah, blah, blah. And that's all I got to say, man.
Mr. Novak?
All I say is that Mr. Hannity yes, I do like Mr. Hannity. This is a very perceptive caller. And I believe, though, he has a left-wing counterpart, Mr. Combs, and so they do give both sides of the story.
Last call for our guest, Lake City, Tennessee. You're on the air.
Mr. Novak, I admire you so much for all the stuff that's been said about you, and you were right about the Democrats that call in on the Republican line. They call in and say, I'm a Republican, but is a Democrat. And Valerie Plame and Joe Wilson should be shunned. I mean, they're out at all these social events, so they're not worried about being assassinated like she said she would be. She was not covert. She wanted to get him out of town, and he sat over there like he said himself and drank tea with his friends. Then she quits her job because I'm sure David Corn, who is a nasty little man, and his mouth reminds me of two toilet seats flapping together, I'm sure he told them they're going to get big bugs. She said she went home to be a full-time mother. Her kids went off to school. Those of us who've been mothers know they need you when they're at home, not when they're off at school.
Well, thank you very much. You know, a lot of people have considerable number of people, including the editorial page of the Washington Post, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, have commented that this is kind of the end of the admissions by Mr. Armitage and the revelation of Mr. Armitage kind of ends this whole story. It was blown out way out of proportion. That the Wilsons look very bad. I haven't written that column because I'm to a certain extent a party to this case, and what I have tried to do is to tell all the things I could tell. I can tell just about everything I know about the case, and I have. And I hope I added to the understanding. But that this was a case that was blown out of proportion, I believe, to try to destroy President Bush. There's a marked lack of interest by Democrats right now in the Armitage revelation. They don't talk about it. They don't admit they're wrong. And you find people like Mr. Corn desperately trying to say that the original story was correct. But I almost think this story is over belatedly and with very good riddance.
Coming up this morning at 11:15 in the Rose Garden will be a press conference with President Bush. No indication of what the topic is, although some think it might be about the detainee legislation in Congress. Final question to you. With this letter that Colin Powell has written to John McCain, and with one of his top aides, the lieutenant colonel who was out on the talk show circuit saying negative things about the administration, and with the fact that the Richard Armitage was leaking this information to you, do you think that Colin Powell will ever break with his president publicly? I mean, and denounce this war?
I don't think he will. That's just a guess on my part. I like General Powell. I talk to him occasionally. I thought he was right in being cautious on the advanced policy of the administration in Iraq. I thought he was wrong when he went before the United Nations on the, talking about the weapons of mass destruction. I didn't think he had the goods then. You see, these things are just not that easy. Not every conservative is a war hawk. Not every liberal is a traitor. But I think that Colin Powell is a military man. I believe he believes in loyalty. I think he's been very careful, certainly not to criticize the president while he is in while he's still in office. After President Bush leaves office might be another matter, but breaking with the president while he still is in the Oval Office, I would guess would be highly unlikely on Colin Powell's part.
Thank you very much, Bob Novak. Have an enjoyable weekend at the University of Illinois, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Have a nice weekend, and C-SPAN will have its regular Washington Journal tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock and the President's News Conference at 11:15.